Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to another Tournament Tactician. This week we have the pseudo-return of something similar to, but not necessarily, Duels of Runeterra, and that's going to be running in a card lock or unified format instead of the traditional riot lock, so that will impact how you build out your lineup, but because we're still kind of feeling out the Shurima meta, what's coming, what's going, I'm not going to focus on lineup creation as much. Instead, I'm going to let you make an educated decision about that, because once you see the decks that I have listed in Tier 1, it'll be pretty obvious the kind of lineup that I'm going to recommend, and that doesn't necessarily change going from Riot Lock to Card Lock. So as usual, we're going to be going over my tournament tier list. At the top, we have Shen Fiora. Now, this isn't in any kind of order I say at the top because it's physically at the top. Shen Fiora, obviously a very strong contender. Not much has changed from last week. Golden Age is still a phenomenal card for this deck. Just fixes a lot of the problems that it was having, especially over something like Relentless Pursuit. Phenomenal card. You know, solid matchups across the board. It's Shen Fiora. You ought to know it by now. Fizz, Twisted Fate, Mind Meld, this deck's not going anywhere without a nerf, I don't think, and it's still, you know, just a dominating performance. I've sort of lumped Aphelios decks together into their own categorization because a lot of them play in a very similar manner, be it the Twisted Fate Aphelios Bilgewater or like the Invoke Atrocity list with Zoe, and even this slower Nightfall deck that started to pop up is basically just an Aphelios deck with Diana and then using copies of the new card Unto Dusk to be able to take advantage of a lot more Nightfall activators. I would definitely categorize the slower Nightfall as an Aphelios deck, but that felt like kind of a cop-out because of what I'm about to tell you, which is if you look at what I have in Tier 1 here and you consider slow Nightfall to be an Aphelios deck and put that up in Tier 1, then 15 of the 16 decks being played at tonight's North American Fight Night are Tier 1 decks on this tier list, and then Henneke brought a Predict Warmother's deck that doesn't quite fit the bill. Unless they just typoed the sheet as soon as they made it live, I'm not 100% sure on that, but operating under the assumption of what I saw, yeah, we are getting less and less diversity in our meta, and as such, that will sort of be reflected on the tier list, right? I mean, that's just kind of how these things work, so we're on the right track, everybody. And then Watcher Control, continuing to just be probably the most dominating deck out of the new set in terms of something that is using a wide variety of cards or has a central strategy focused on newer cards. And actually, all three archetypes from Week 1 did persist into Week 2. The Draklorn Inquisitor version has gone a little bit more all-in on the Draklorn Inquisitor and is at a point of even main decking copies of Frozen Thrall, which not going to help you much in the aggro matchups, but as we can see here, there's a lot more mid-range and control-style decks near the top of the tier list, so if you are expecting a lot more slower decks, a lot more Shadow Isle, things like that, doesn't necessarily play out for you this weekend because of card lock. You're not going to see as much Shadow Isle, but in a Riot Lock format going forward, yeah, the Draklorn Inquisitor version, I could see you getting away with this. Caveat to that, a lot more It That Stares are being mained in these Watcher decks. The Revitalizing Roar version still sticking around. I don't even expect to see the Draklorn version as much in competitive play. I think a lot of players are cutting that for more Turbo Watcher style, Matron style of the deck. And Revitalizing Roar is really just like your traditional TLC. Ladros is my backup win con. I'm playing a very standard control deck. And then Turbo Watcher is running those Matrons, sometimes running a copy of Fading Memories, but by no means necessary or mandatory. But the really cool thing about what the Spectral Matron combo does is that once you have played your 2 8-drops to get your Watcher into hand, then Matron into Watcher makes your Watcher 0 mana, and it's just really consistent at beating the Mirror and other control decks because they have multiple Watchers, and they get their Watcher down a lot earlier than you would necessarily expect them to. They don't have to telegraph it with something like Revitalizing Roar. It just comes out, you immediately have to answer it, and while you probably do have a lot of mana to answer it, it just kind of is what it is. Deck is very solid, doing a lot of things. Expect this to kind of continue on the upward trend. Tier 2, we've got another bevy of cool new decks. We've got Lucian Azir. This is sort of the aggro deck that stuck out to everybody. It hasn't gone anywhere. It really hasn't gotten refined a whole lot more. Still iffy on this one because, as I had mentioned last week, it's a Lucian deck, and I have feelings about Lucian decks where they come out really strong out of the gate, they high roll, and then they kind of fall off the face of the planet. It's only week 2, so this one shouldn't have fallen off yet. It'll probably continue to be played in a lot of aggro lineups, and as far as I can tell, especially coming into something like this card lock format, it really doesn't take much out of your lineup. There's not a lot that you're running in Lucian Azir that you're running in other tier 1 or 2 decks that you want to be bringing. Then Tom Raka, I'm going to have to defend this one, and I'm totally prepared to do that, but I think that Tom Raka has good matchups into some of the bigger and better decks of the format. Historically, it does pretty well against these board wipe style control decks like the Turbo Watcher is bringing out. It doesn't really have a way to interact with the Watcher combo outside of Hush, which is a bit of a problem, but you know, you just continually run out your self-damaging units. If your opponent goes to play a board wipe, then I'm talking the sort of ideal situation here. Your opponent throws out a board wipe, you heal your units, they just take more damage. The Star Spring continues to tick tick up. And if they don't try to kill your units, you just start to beat the hell out of them with all of these 1 and 2 drops that you have assembled that are, you know, at 1 or 2 HP. You get a Star Spring on board. It's actually something that's pretty difficult for Control to deal with, but I understand players not going for something like this. The Targon Bilgewater deck of the format is very much a Felios Twisted Fate, as well as the deck's not very fun. It's not very consistent, but I do still stand by the fact that Star Spring is a very solid tournament choice. I don't think anybody's going to, like, flame you for bringing this. Then we have a Felios PNZ. This deck's pretty tempo-oriented, and while that does work out for certain matchups in the format, it doesn't work out for others. I can't really imagine a Felios PNZ beating something like Lysandra, but I do still think that it has enough good matchups in the format that it gets to stick around in a tier 2 spot. Overwhelm aggro, kind of on the way out, but players are still about it. I really wouldn't expect to see it in tournaments too much, but because it is still a known factor, I want to keep it on the tier list. Lee Sin has fallen a little bit from grace. We really don't see this deck too often. I don't think its matchups are that great, and I really don't think you're going to see it in something like a card lock format because of the overlap on Ionia and just the overall power of Shen Fiora at the moment. I think that unless you're going for a triple Ionia lineup, you're not going to be seeing a lot of Lee Sin right now. And I don't know if that's just playstyle. We're all bored of Lee Sin. We think there are better options. There's too much aggro that's still running around. There's a lot of varying factors, but what I can say with a degree of confidence is that Lee Sin is not as popular as it once was, and I don't think it's going to be coming back over the next week or two. And, you know, if it does, I'll adjust it on the tier list as necessary, but it's a little bit of a dark horse right now. And I really haven't seen anybody try to make it work. It's just kind of falling off a little bit, and sometimes things like that happen. And I don't think that the power level and consistency were necessarily so high that Lee Sin's the hill that I'm willing to die on. This is still a tier 1 deck. No, I think it's fine to keep it down here. And Timelines Ladros, there's been a lot of debate about concurrent timelines and how good the combo is for the game versus how good the deck is, and it's a Shadow Isle Piltover and Zon control deck. It's got some cool tools to deal with things, but for the most part, it's still a Shadow Isle Piltover and Zon control deck, and that comes with its own inherent flaws that it always has. The deck hasn't really gotten more consistent. The one piece of advice I do have about this, if you are playing a control matchup, don't play timelines. Just discard it to Rummage and try to Ladros them to death. It's going to work out more often than trying to Dreadway Ladros them, I promise. Feel the Rush seems to be the only other Shadow Isle failure control deck that's kind of stuck around. It's just got a more immediate finish to it, and because it is essentially running all of the same things as the Lysandra control deck in terms of removal, the Feel the Rush gets to ramp a little bit harder because the Lysandra decks aren't really running that. It'll take multiple cards committed on the side of the Lysandra player to deal with that, and, one thing that you can do to win a control mirror is because I talked a lot about in the Draven Ezreal meta, where we were really focused on turn 8, where Captain Farron was the turn that things got decided, and therefore Invoke had this really big window in the meta where you play Eclipse Dragon on turn 7, nobody else has a turn 7 play, and that sets you up really good going into these weird turn 8 stalemates. Feel the Rush does something similar, where now we're all talking about this Ladros thing going on with all these control mirrors. They're all trying to drop Ladros or set up big combos on turn 9, and then turn 8, you just drop a Tryndamere. And that's something that's difficult to deal with, and you just get to go ahead and continue to run that out, and it sort of fills the same space. Frostbite midrange, we saw a little bit of Ashe LeBlanc. I think Ashe Sejuani's still sort of the favorite, especially as more and more Avalanche decks pop up in the meta. You got a cool new Draw 2 card, and you've got a couple of better matchups than you did in the previous meta. You still get hosed by all the tier 1 decks. Don't recommend it, but there are some Frostbite midrange purists out there, and I think that the draw power that they got was a big help for the deck's consistency. And then we have Nightfall, which, as I had mentioned, making a big comeback both on the aggressive and the slower side. I already talked about this one, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but I do think that if you're expecting a lot of aggro, Nightfall's always sort of been the anti-aggro deck, but this slower version is definitely the one that I want to watch evolve over the course of the weekend, and could even just get categorized as an Aphelios deck rather than a Nightfall deck, but having Unto Dusk in there is a really nice tool for it, and I am happy to see that we get to see something take advantage of that. I will admit, Tier 3 is kind of just a throwaway tier of things that I don't think we're going to see too often, but still will pop up in a tournament enough that I want to touch on them and talk about them. It's more so just a reminder to me that, hey, to talk about this deck like Draven Ezreal. I don't think Draven Ezreal really does a lot into the current landscape. I would imagine that in theory, and I have not seen this matchup play out at all, but in theory, it's got an okay chance against Lysandra control just because you need to aggro it out. You are very much on a clock. You do not have a way to deal with the Watcher. What you do have is a lot of 3 HP units that is going to force your opponent to string together 2 board wipes. Now, how much that actually gets done for you is a big question mark, because they have so many 1 and 2 damage board wipes between Avalanche and Blighted Ravine, and then Ice Shard as well as Withering Wail. You know, maybe you can't get it done even if you do start as aggressively as possible, but yeah, that's kind of where you're falling right now as a Draven Ezreal player. Is just like as the Turbo Watcher deck, you know, continues to rise. And if they didn't have Ice Shard, yeah, maybe Draven Ezreal has a good matchup into it. But I mean, I don't think you were beating Burblefish Mind Meld. I don't really like your chances versus Aphelios either. Draven Ezreal is one of those things where any mid-range deck, you're probably going to cream it, but there's not a whole lot of mid-range popping up in, you know, tier 1 and stuff right now. And even Shen Fiora with the Nopify back in a big way, just has more tools to negate your primary spells and things like that. It's looking rough for Draven Ezreal. Fearsome, you know, just kind of always there. Something to keep in mind. Pirate aggro, haven't seen this at all since the new set dropped. Really just falling to the wayside in favor of things like Lucian Azir and Overwhelm, things of that nature. Frostbite Foundry was pretty consistently considered to be just a Lee Sin counter, and as I'd mentioned, we saw a decline in Lee Sin. It stands to reason we'll see a decline in Frostbite Foundry, and the consistency problems with this deck is really starting to catch up to it. Nasus Endure, we had the Thresh and the Kindred version. I think that the Thresh version ended up winning out, and whether you want to run this deck aggressively or in a more control style, it feels like it's just shy of being good. Like there's some missing secret ingredient, some X factor missing from Nasus Endure that, and I say Endure to reflect the style of play of the Nasus, not so much that like this is not a Freljord deck. This is a Shadow Isle and Shurima deck. I don't mean to be confusing with that, but it definitely feels like there's an X factor missing from this to stop it from being a competitive choice. Then we have Anivia, you know, just really falling to the wayside. I can't imagine Anivia gets to come back. It doesn't really beat these other control decks, especially something like the Matron combo, because your only answer for the Watcher is hard removing it, and using that hard removal on an Ephemeral Watcher followed by an Ephemeral Watcher, it's a complete disaster for the Anivia player, and I don't think it's something that you can really come back from. Scouts, really, again, same thing as Pirate aggro, just kind of falling to the wayside in favor of other decks. We're not in that spell-heavy TF Burble and Lee Sin are in every lineup. We have 2 good matchups. No, it's the old aggro decks are just really falling off as Lee Sin continues to fall off, is basically what we're seeing trend here. And then discard aggro, just not consistent. A lot of 1 damage board wipes in something like the Watcher, and really any Shadow Isle deck in general, and even something like the Invoke decks are just getting more and more removal with the Twisted Fate and, you know, all that kind of stuff. They just get to play lower to the ground and kind of meet you down there with things like Spacey Sketcher and Dusk Petal Dust and or Lunari Duskbringer, and it's just not looking good for a lot of aggro decks right now, unless you're doing something crazy unfair like summoning 6 units every time you want to attack, like Lucian Azir is. But even then, as I'd mentioned, it's a Lucian deck. I'm not expecting it to remain in the meta indefinitely. And that is going to do it for us this week on Tournament Tactician. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that was at least a little bit helpful as we get into this weekend. I will have a link in the description below for the signups for Duels of Runeterra, so you guys can go out and have a good one with that. And as far as what kind of lineup you would bring this weekend, I really just recommend picking 3 of the 4 tier 1 decks. I mean, Shen Fiora, like the regional composition of the tier 1 decks is even so diversified that you can really just pick any 3 of them. I mean, Shen Fiora, there's no other Demacia or Ionia deck in there. You're playing a mostly Targon deck when you're playing Aphelios, so whatever splash region you need. You know, if you just want to go like Shen Fiora, Invoke with Atrocity, and then Tia Fizz, like you don't even have any overlapping regions. So I think that that's a pretty solid lineup that we're going to see consistently across Top Cut this weekend. But very excited to cast it. I will be there with Shit Just Works, who is in the middle of a rebrand, so his name is currently Coming Soon TM on most places, Discord, Twitter, things like that. But the Twitch channel will be the same. It will still be Shit Just Works, at least for this weekend. We'll see. I'll keep you guys updated on his rebrand because it does very much impact where you can see me cast. So looking forward to that one. But thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.